Nuclear power can trace its ancestry back to the beginning man's endeavors to make his life easier. From the creation of the Noria to the steam engine to the nuclear power plant, each discovery, creation, and invention was one great man or woman using the building blocks laid by previous pioneers to further the prosperity and growth of mankind. Mankind seemed to reach their zenith with the discovery of power of atomic fission, the harnessing of that power, and the utilization of that power for the betterment of mankind. But with great power comes great responsibility. Man initially used nuclear power for destructive purposes, almost surprising themselves with its awesome power. Man quickly turned to more peaceful commercial applications for nuclear power, but that did not diminish the amount of opposition to nuclear power. Nuclear accidents and tragedies, though relatively few on the worldwide scale, haunted the industry and further drove opponents to be more vocal in their diatribes. For decades, the nuclear power industry stagnated. Construction and operational safety concerns drove the prices of nuclear power higher than expected. Fossil fuels and renewable sources of energy saw a rebound in certain areas of the world, snuffing out the nuclear presence altogether. But with renewed dedication to streamlining the application, construction, and operational processes, along with focus on educating the public, nuclear power will see significant growth in the near future. In the past 150 years, our world has dramatically changed from one dependent on physical labors of man and beast to one dependent on the power generation of Earth's resources. For millennia, man's vehicles were powered by man's own two legs or by the legs of animals. Horse-drawn chariots led charges in battles. Horse-drawn wagons hauled the fruits of labor to markets. Various kinds of cattle and equines have been used as beasts of burden throughout the history of man. Man has even been creative and has domesticated camels and elephants. These beasts of burdens have pushed or pulled loads, carried people on different errands for adventures. They have even been trained to push a mill to grind corn or some other substance. The dependence on animals in history was long and burdensome. Depending on your worldview, man did not create the first machine for hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, or a couple thousand years. Around 5th or 4th century BC, the first Indians developed a machine called the Noria. The predecessor to the water wheel, the Noria was first used to merely transport water, then later developed to use its rotary power for other uses like milling, grinding, or boring. By the 11th century AD, the Noria had spread from China to the Atlantic Ocean. By the 12th century AD, the Noria had spread throughout medieval Europe. 1600 years elapsed between the time the Noria was developed to the time Europe was introduced to the Noria. The simplest of ideas, based on original thought, spread throughout the known world in 1600 years. Still, the development of the steam engine took another 600 years. The power of steam was realized over 200 years prior, but took that long to be able to understand it enough to be able to harness its power. By the end of the 19th century, steam had been fully harnessed to power ships, locomotives, and automobiles. Man had finally kicked its reliance on draft animals for transportation and labor. In conjunction with the development of the steam engine for labor and modes of transportation, uranium was discovered. However, the ionizing radiation and fission properties of uranium isotopes was not harnessed until more than 100 years later. But once the process of harnessing uranium began, it snowballed unexpectedly fast. Between 1896 and 1945, compounding discoveries were made using uranium isotopes. Röntgen started by discovering ionizing radiation. Villard, Meitner, Frisch, the Curies, Hahn, and Strassmann all had a hand in bringing about the discovery that uranium fission gave off not only energy, but also neutrons. The nuclear hotbed of Germany, Austria, and France bubbled over and spread like wildfire to the rest of the world. Limited worldwide communication initially hindered the spread of information concerning nuclear fission, but an unlikely contributor eventually helped the spread. The Nazi Germany threat sent minority scientists fleeing in a westerly direction across the world. German, Austrian, and French scientists found refuge in Britain and in the United States. Not only did they find refuge from the German war machine, they found like minds who eagerly learned what they had to share of their own experiences with uranium and fission. Peaceful scientists like Meitner soon found out that when the world is at war, all discoveries and research will be funded for war. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the world, Russia too had a stake in nuclear fission. Once again, a science boom stemmed from war. The Bolshevik Revolution actually bolstered scientific research. Snelikov, Kapitsa, and Vernadsky led the way for Russia, bringing the knowledge gained from studying abroad back home and spreading their knowledge throughout European Russia. For both Russia and the Allied countries, research into nuclear fission received most of its funding for war-fighting projects. Einstein and Fermi, both who were war refugees from Europe, understood the inherent dangers in atomic energy, especially since it was a field that had yet to be explored in depth. Einstein and Fermi both petitioned the United States government to fund an atomic energy research project in order to learn more of atomic chain reactions, their dangers, and their uses. President Roosevelt was initially disinclined to pursue a project that he deemed useless but still acquiesced. As World War II progressed, focus progressed to war projects, and even atomic energy research was not exempt. War applications for atomic energy research became officially known as the Manhattan Project in 1941. Initial research projects of the Manhattan Project were in place mainly for defense and deterrence. Intelligence divulged that Nazi Germany was researching atomic energy and had learned how to split the uranium atom. The United States feared war applications from the Germans, so they developed their own war applications. Less than a year of the commissioning of the Manhattan Project, a successful chain reaction was achieved in Chicago. After this, the funding flowed more abundantly, and a fully operational atomic bomb was detonated in July 1945. The United States was the first country to fully realize the awesome power of an atomic bomb detonation, but only 1 month later, the world would see that awesome tragic power. A successful test in the New Mexico desert and the rising death toll in the war efforts in the Pacific persuaded President Truman to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. 120,000 Japanese civilians instantly perished in two separate mornings in August 1945. The Japanese emperor surrendered a week and a half later because he realized that the United States had a vast head start in the nuclear arms race. He had no hope of winning the war against the raw destructive power of the atomic bomb. After the conclusion of World War II, the United States government sought a more useful purpose to the funding aligned for atomic research. Continuing with the research for war applications was highly expensive with no return. War was over. The government decided to alter the application side to commercial in order to retain the funding for research. The United States effectively split its research into both military and commercial applications. However, the United States did keep an eye on Stalin in the USSR and how he was consolidating power and employing his own research into atomic energy. The USSR was late in arriving in the power game of nuclear arms, but caught up quickly. With the defeat of Nazi Germany at the end of World War II, the USSR utilized German scientists who had already been performing research on atomic energy. Stalin squirreled secret cities in the Ural Mountains well away from prying eyes. Ultimately, the USSR climaxed their initial atomic research with a successful atomic bomb test in 1947 in Kazakhstan. The push for peaceful applications for nuclear power began with the sudden and catastrophic conclusion of World War II. Every sound mind around the world realized nuclear power's destructive capabilities. With the Atomic Energy Act in 1946 and again with amendments in 1954, the United States pushed for peaceful uses of atomic energy to the maximum extent possible. The United States established the Atomic Energy Commission as the governing agency to ensure that the country's focus remained on peaceful power generation while remaining vigilant and flexible towards the strategic defense of the populace and military might. The developing technology of atomic research caused scientists in both the East and the West to ponder the possibilities in the commercial field. More than 5 years before the end of World War II, Frisch and Perls published a memorandum stating how nuclear power could be harnessed to provide a compact source of heat for steam and electricity generation. Ideas for applications soon sprouted like weeds: commercial electricity generation, shipping, warships, nuclear weapons, automobiles. Meanwhile, in the USSR, the Russians also realized that nuclear power could be harnessed for so much more than weapons of mass destruction. Both the USSR and United States toyed with several different ideas of nuclear reactors for power generation. The ideas for fuel were of ranging isotopes of uranium and plutonium. Moderators differed widely from water to graphite, coolant ranged from water to sodium. Experiments even compared and contrasted using fast or thermal neutrons to begin the fission process. Just as the military applications of nuclear power climaxed with successful bomb explosions by the USSR and United States, the climax of successful nuclear power electricity generation came from both the USSR and United States. In 1951, the United States successfully generated electricity in a plant in Idaho, and the USSR successfully generated electricity for a grid in 1954. However, a lesser-known participant in the nuclear power industry was the first to bring online a commercial nuclear power plant. In 1956, Great Britain opened the world's first full-scale nuclear power plant for business in Calder Hall, Cumberland, England, supplying the town of Workington before supplying power to the capital of London. With the success of the United States, USSR, and Great Britain, other countries soon wanted in on the action. Germany was war-torn, literally down the middle into East and West Germany. Berlin also was divided. Germany's neighboring countries were not large, not as wealthy as the United States, USSR, or Great Britain. Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, all touched by the recent World War and all affected by dwindling supplies of fossil fuels, formed a coalition to pool resources and funding for nuclear power research. In 1957 in Rome, these small war-torn countries signed a treaty forming the European Atomic Energy Commission, Euratom. The treaty signed in Rome was similar to the Atomic Energy Act put forth in the United States. Funding for atomic energy research for military pursuits would be diverted to commercial enterprises. From the outset, this coalition recognized nuclear power as the next step in development and that nuclear power could be pursued to peaceful ends. In parallel to the commercial ventures of Great Britain, the USSR, the United States, and Euratom, the world was pursuing peaceful legislation of nuclear power. In 1953, President Eisenhower addressed the resident nations of the United Nations, speaking of the inherent dangers of misuse of atomic energy, the usefulness of nuclear power as a source of electrical power, and a means of regulating who has permission to pursue researching atomic energy. All 81 nations of the then United Nations unanimously voted to approve the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. The IAEA was created to legislate and regulate the means of how countries pursued nuclear power. The IAEA addressed the means of acquisition of materials and how funding was distributed, whether to commercial or military applications. From the end of World War II, just like with most other wars, the victorious nations saw a spike in economic growth requiring a reliable energy source. The USSR, United States, and Great Britain, along with Canada and France, plunged headlong into the commercial growth of nuclear power. During the 1960s, this growth almost seemed more of a fad than an actual sustainable energy source. No country had dealt with the burden of recycling or burying spent fuel yet, nor had a tragedy yet made international headlines. The leading countries in nuclear power sowed nuclear power plants throughout their land and reaped bountifully from the harvest. By 1970, the United States alone had orders for over 50 commercial nuclear power plants. Canada boosted not only its own but also the United States and other developing countries' nuclear industries with its bountiful uranium deposits. Then in 1973, the nuclear power industry found an unlikely ally. The oil embargo of 1973 caused the United States, Great Britain, France, and other countries to seek alternative fuel sources. As a result, the nuclear power industry realized its historical peak. Electrical power generation by nuclear power was rising by huge factors. The United States saw a rise of 5% in commercial nuclear power, but France put every other country to shame. France's nuclear power industry rose by a factor of almost 10, from 8% to 78%. France even expanded so that they were supplying electrical power to Great Britain and Italy and selling their designs to countries like South Africa, South Korea, and China. By the end of the 1970s, most every European country had at least one nuclear power plant, and nuclear power spanned the globe from North Korea to Argentina. As nuclear power peaked in the United States, its own governing agency became steeped in controversy. The Atomic Energy Commission was embattled with reports of inadequacy in regulations in the fields of radiation protection, site planting, and environmental stewardship. Congress reached their limit of complaints and ill reports and decided to abolish the AEC. They replaced the AEC with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with the Energy Reorganization Act of 1974. The new act delineated the newly founded NRC's responsibilities and delegated it the power necessary to regulate licenses, materials, and construction, along with ensuring safety during construction and operation. The NRC became deeply focused on the radiation protection and reactor safety during operation with hopes to squelch the common public mistrust of nuclear power and to ensure that the nuclear industry enjoyed a long and fruitful lifespan.